Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Intro to International Relations lecture on human rights. Before I get started, just a reminder to you all that you hopefully are checking your email and you got the email with your Libya papers back, but you also, and ideally before you even look at the attachment with my comments, all the attachments should have comments and they should all have a grade. But you should also look, before you look at those, look at the announcement that I posted in Canvas. When you're watching this, it will be yesterday morning, but before I sent out any of those. The announcement's going to explain a little bit of, and hopefully avoid some questions that folks might have about aspects of the grading. But also, and probably the single most important thing it's going to tell you is that you add 10 points to the scores on your papers. And that's the grade that's going to go in the grade book, not the one that's on. I graded them individually and tried to be as consistent as I could, as always, but decided to just add 10 to everybody's score at the end. So hopefully no complaints about that extra 10 points. I'm anticipating that there won't be any. So we're going to talk about human rights today. I'm just going to, you probably will already be able to see this, but I'm going to explain a little bit. Today is sort of a mini lecture. So normally, right, we would have already discussed our news article on the response to the I guess recent Turkish investigation into the Khashoggi killing, and we'd then have what is happening now, a little mini lecture, and then discuss the Simmons article by Beth Simmons in the Minkston Snyder Reader. So that's going to sort of happen in the same way, in the sense that you've read the news article. I'm going to give this mini lecture that will be pretty brief, and then you're just going to discuss the Simmons article. There's a separate discussion thread on Canvas with that, which I would really prefer. The goal would be that you do that after the lecture, which is designed to kind of set the ground, provide you with a background on human rights and international relations. Okay, so that's where we're headed. There we go. Always takes a second to get that first slide. I don't know why that is the case, but it always takes a second to get that to come through. So here's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about human rights basics. What are they? Different kinds of rights. Where do they come from? Then the two big things we're going to be discussing are tools that states or non-state actors actually can use to increase state compliance with human rights and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And then finally, we'll talk about challenges in increasing compliance that states, or that any actor who wants to see more compliance with human rights norms faces. Okay, so some of the basics that I want to talk about here. First of all, that human rights and just the concept, because let's step back a second, there is a sort of a basic concept underlying this discussion, which is that there are these things called universal human rights. Now, what if we were meeting as a class and normally, and we had a lot of back and forth ability and back and forth time, one of the things we would discuss is whether you all think that there are in fact human rights and what those, whether you in fact think that there are universal human rights. So human rights that all human beings have just by the sheer nature of being human. But the concept that human beings all have certain basic rights is grounded, in different religions. Most of the major religions have some conception of basic universal human rights, and in the religious conception, it's generally that God gave human being gods, right? The God of that particular religion, or gods, I guess, as the case might be. But that the God, bestows on its people, or the humans on the planet, certain rights, Enlightenment philosophy is also seen as an important source of sectarian source of universal human rights. And then kind of politically and historically, the French Revolution comes up with a rights of man and of the citizen that is also seen as a critical juncture in terms of this process. In terms of our discussion, though, the single most important moment for what are, today seen as human rights comes with the UN General Assembly passing in 1948 the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Now, one thing to say up front is that the United Nations General Assembly, it's the resolutions that it passes are sort of, if people know this term, kind of like a sense of the Senate. That is, they are an expression of global opinion, right, on any particular issue, no matter what it is. So to be clear, what the United Nations General Assembly passes is not codified international law. It's not a treaty, to go back to what we discussed last time. So even though treaties and international law, of course, has its own compliance problems, as we discussed in the lecture on international law, this is even more removed. Just to be clear, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is even more removed because it is not even a treaty, but rather a resolution passed by the United Nations General Assembly. So the other thing to say up front about this Universal Declaration of Human Rights is that it was the moment, or the reason for passing this at this moment, rather, is that, of course, with both the Holocaust but other kind of large-scale abuses, and we should note they're mostly the abuses by the vanquished, by either Nazi Germany or Imperial Japan. So, for example, the firebombing of Dresden, the firebombing of Tokyo, these things, didn't get as much attention as the Holocaust as, and I'm not attempting to put those two in parallels, but in any case, the reaction to particularly the atrocities of Nazi Germany is what led to the UN General Assembly debating and then adopting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So actually what you see is, and of course, this is another important element of the moment, is the United States and the Soviet Union both agreeing on their sort of hatred and opposition to anything that Nazi Germany did. Right. So that's why you have a willingness to try for the U.S. and the Soviet Union to come together and come up with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Now, there are two parts or two kinds of human rights that are discussed in the Universal Declaration. The first are going to be the most familiar to most of you, and that is mostly civil and political rights. These are referred to as negative rights, and the reason they're referred to as negative rights is because they're limits on things that for the most part, limits on things that the government might do, or governments might do, if it's not limited, right? So the government could limit free speech as a way to increase its power. It could clamp down on free press that criticizes it. It could clamp down on religions that it finds a threat to itself, right? It could engage in torture, cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment as a way to either intimidate rivals or as a way to maybe, maintain order or deal with civil threats, right? So governments could do those things, but the idea of these civil political rights is that they're limited. The government is limited in its ability to engage in these kinds of behaviors. Now, like I said, these tend to be the ones that they resonate. They're the rights that you see in the Bill of Rights. They tend to be the ones that just resonate and make the most sense with Americans. There's a second category, the economic and social or positive rights. These are rights that the argument goes that governments are obliged to provide for their citizens, right? And so if we start with one that's probably the least controversial even here, the idea is that government is supposed to provide people with K through 12 education, right? For example, people of all, and most people would agree. Now, we can dispute whether you should do that through charter, and people will debate whether you should do that through charter schools versus public schools. But the idea is that everybody should have the access to K through 12 education within the United States, right? And so that's pretty minimally controversial, right? Many of other countries and most of the other wealthy countries in the world have some form of guaranteed healthcare. So even a country like Britain that is otherwise very similar to the United States, that is, it tends more toward the right side of the spectrum among these countries, has a national health service that even parties on the right side of the political spectrum do not try to dismantle. Now, they go through periods, and this has been the case of Britain since the financial crisis, where they're sort of trying to starve the National Health Service and have been criticized for that, but not trying to get rid of it. So to give you a sense, then there are more controversial ones, like in the UN, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. There's a right to food. There's a right to shelter. There's a right to work, which sounds pretty crazy to most Americans. There even is, this is my favorite. Normally I bring in my little copy of the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights. My favorite one is there's a right to, quote, rest and leisure. So just remember that. If any of you have parents that are trying to make you do all these, house cleaning chores and activities, just say, look, whip out your copy of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and say, I have the right to rest and leisure. Might be a little bit of a debate over how you define that, but in any case. So now's the point where we have generally in class, I pose a question, so I'm gonna pose it and then pause and let you guys see what you guys think. How did you end up with with these two very different kinds of rights in this one document? What do you think? Anybody? Bueller? So basically what happened is the U.S. and the U.S.'s leading allies were really responsible for the civil political rights. Excuse me. And the Soviet Union was really responsible for those economic and social positive rights. So that's really the story that we have in terms of how we got these two different kinds of rights. And basically, because this is the last bit of discussion in terms of the Universal Declaration, is that at the time in 1948, because it was non-binding, everybody just was adding stuff, and that was okay, because then the Soviet Union could say, hey, we're going to really emphasize and provide the economic and social rights to our people, and the U.S. said, well, we're going to provide the civil and political rights to our people, and nobody was worried about not providing any of these rights. So the last thing that I would just note is that today, and so, like I said, normally we have a discussion about, are there universal human rights? What are those universal human rights? Well, if you look at something like Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch, where those are the two biggest NGOs that have a lot to do with human rights. If you look at those organizations, what do they tend to focus on? Well, they tend to focus on, and this is where I think there is the most agreement internationally, not to say I would not pretend that there is universal agreement, right? But where there is the most agreement is on the extreme end of the civil, political, negative rights spectrum, right? So they tend to focus in Amnesty and in Human Rights Watch, they tend to focus on those kinds of abuses overwhelmingly. You don't see Amnesty International, putting out a report on the lack of rest and leisure in the world. they tend to focus on the violations of the civil and political rights. They tend to focus on the most egregious violations. So torture, this is the example that I gave, that torture is taking place, has taken place, and this is from the 2018 report. So in the prior year, in 144 countries. So that's a lot of countries in the world, which also poses the next issue, which is that clearly there's a lot of human rights being violated here, even if you take the most extreme and the most extreme of the civil political rights. So that's pretty much what I wanted to say about human rights basics. So how do you get states to engage in more compliance with human rights? And again, even if when I say human rights here and for the rest of what I'm talking about, let's agree that we're really focused on those political rights, and that we're really focused on within those civil and political rights. We're really focused on the most egregious violations, not, I don't know, whether the school newspaper can publish an article that's critical of the school, right? Which is a violation of free speech rights. But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about things like torture. We're talking about things like, cracking down on a free press because it's criticizing the government, things like that. Okay. So how do you increase compliance? Well, the first actually relates very much to what I was just talking about. So if you go on any of these websites, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, you might ask yourself, well, why do these groups exist? Like, why do people, and basically, by the way, they exist on the basis, most of them, of contributions by, regular human beings who donate money to them. Some of them get grants, etc., from foundations, but most of it is, in the case of Amnesty, it's individual members, giving them money, etc. But what is their purpose? What do they do? Well, what they do very simply is that they kind of serve almost like journalists, in the sense that it's their job to report on human rights abuses where they occur, with the idea that that will either directly or indirectly put social pressure on the governments responsible for violating their citizens' rights. So governments will be ashamed by this news, by this coverage, and therefore they'll be less likely to engage in human rights abuses. So it's very important in that process. I won't say a ton about this, but it's very important in that process. And so the groups try really hard to make sure that they're incredibly reliable, and that the claims that they make about human rights abuses are, verified to, maybe even a higher standard than even quality journalism. So that, because, they want to make sure that they're trusted. The leading news media sources often will then publish reports, or will draw on reports from those human rights organizations, but it's the organizations themselves that are the source of that information, that then either the media or other governments will then draw on and bring to light as a means of criticizing the government that's responsible for the abuses. And when I said indirect, so what sometimes will happen is, let's say, walk you through this. So let's say we're talking about, one of the instances lately is just coming to mind is the Philippines, where the Duterte government has been, basically since coming to power, Duterte has encouraged, not so much these days, he's backed away from it, but initially was encouraging people to go out and shoot drug dealers, and in sort of a vigilante justice sort of style. Well, the idea is one way to get them to change their actions is to just keep drawing to light every time that they're doing this, and how many times they're doing it, and how many people are affected, right? But another way is to get others that maybe have economic relations or provide foreign aid to the Philippines. So let's say you convince the United States that this is a bad thing, and that was definitely the case early. early with the Obama administration, so early in the Duterte government, but then when Trump came into power, he didn't have that position. So if you get the United States, is my point, to criticize that government and put pressure on that government, that's sometimes an alternative. Second, you can get governments that maybe are obviously, you know, the North Koreas of the world aren't going to sign on to an international agreement on human rights, but maybe governments that are a little bit kind of in the middle, you get them to sign on to an international agreement, and the hope is that then that has some impact. In the Simmons article, you're going to discuss that a little bit more in terms of how exactly that might play out. Some interesting stuff there on the role that judiciaries in some of these governments play. You could put sanctions on human rights violators, and this is both economic sanctions, as in we're not going to trade with you, or we're not going to, either we're not going to sell you our stuff, or we're not going to buy any of your stuff. Or another sort of way you could think about sanctions is if you've got foreign aid relationship, or military aid relationship for that matter, with one of these countries, you could decide that you're going to stop that aid or that military aid. So sanctions to punish them. Not a lot of evidence that this is successful, but it's a tool in the toolkit. And then finally, there is the option that you can engage in some sort of military intervention. Now, the Libya case is an example where this happened. Not necessarily, and I think Libya poses a great example of whether it was primarily for human rights abuses alone. Even those of you who wrote your paper on it might have a different idea. My own perspective on this, and I've written on this, is that it's rarely for human rights alone. That it's often, something else, and probably some element of national interest probably has to be at stake. Okay. Finally, a little bit of a discussion here on challenges in increasing compliance. So why is it hard to get states to treat their people better and do more what they're supposed to do in terms of human rights? Well, the basic point here is actually rather simple, which is, even before we get into this, is that the default historically has been this, sovereignty, as we've discussed at multiple points in the semester. And so sovereignty means you do whatever you want internally. And so the tough thing is to get states to actually do something other than just, okay. So one scenario here is states that are so powerful, either economic sense, military sense, maybe they have nuclear weapons, whatever it is, that not only do you not want to put pressure on them, but maybe you just can't put enough pressure on them. So China, for quite some time, has been able to engage in human rights abuses and get away with it. Now, I think one thing that's interesting that you see with the most recent, I think we've talked a little bit in class about the Uyghur Muslims and China sending them to concentration camps. They are sensitive to criticism. They don't, like in North Korea would basically just say, screw you, when others complain about its human rights record. China, for the most part, is saying, no, we're not doing that. Even though, of course, there's like repeated reports and very accurate reporting of what they're doing with these sort of reprogramming, attempts to get people to stop being Muslim, basically, because they see religion as a threat to the Chinese Communist Party. So China's been sensitive to this, and that's interesting, but it's not changing its behavior fundamentally, at least for the most part. I do think, just on the same topic, another kind of similar, or another interesting thing is, I think if you had taken the Communist Party's instinct with the recent protests in Hong Kong, their instinct would have been to crack down a lot more heavily. And they didn't because of their sensitivity to external opinion. But all that said, it's not like they're going to, give either the Uyghur Muslims or the people of Hong Kong what they want. It's just that they're restrained, maybe, I don't know, 5% or 10%, and are sensitive somehow to international public opinion. Okay, what about what I'm referring to here as medium states? So countries that may have either a political relationship or some sort of asset that makes the other states in the international system look the other way. So I mentioned two here. Pakistan, since 9/11, has been an important, frenemy, basically, of the United States with regard to the war on terrorism. That is, they have helped the United States out a fair bit. On the other hand, we found out that, Osama bin Laden was basically hanging out next to the equivalent of Pakistan's equivalent of West Point. But they were doing lots of things that the United States wanted during this entire period. So that was their, golden ticket to escape U.S. criticism. Saudi Arabia got a great, not just with the Khashoggi case that you read about today, but with all kinds of areas where they're responsible for human rights abuses, both within their territory and also in interventions that they're engaging in, for example, in Yemen. In the U.S., essentially because of the oil relationship, but also because of their role in the region as the leading opponent to Iran, the United States looks the other way overwhelmingly. Sometimes you have states that are so weak and unimportant that nobody really has an interest in caring. And this is where I think you see with Myanmar and the Rohingya, that we've discussed earlier in the semester. So they were able to engage in this genocide, by most definitions, and nobody in the international community really did much. And it wasn't because they didn't have leverage. It was because most of the rest of the international community just didn't care. There weren't refugee flows to major states of importance. And so most countries in the world just, didn't do much. Some countries will have a compelling reason for why they're engaging in, why they have exceptions to human rights, right? And I'm not saying this is compelling to everyone, these arguments that they make, but that they are making arguments. So Israel is an excellent example, criticized frequently for human rights abuses, and they'll say, well, these are necessary for, to provide security given the threats that we face. Leave it up to you in terms of what you think. But lest you think it's just Israel, this is definitely what in the United States was the position after 9/11 when the U.S. was engaging in waterboarding, etc. Aside from the questions of the question of whether those techniques were in fact useful, a fair amount of debate. I think most of the weight of the evidence is on them not being useful. But leaving that aside, certainly the argument at the time was, well, this is necessary because we're in this unprecedented moment of challenge that we face relative to terrorist security threat. And then finally, there are some countries that, I should say, actually, with a country like North Korea, it's really two things. One is there's very little leverage because almost all of the international community has no relationships, trade relationships, etc., with North Korea. The countries that do, like China, don't care, right? So there's no leverage, one. And then two, they don't care what anybody thinks. So again, North Korea is going to be completely insensitive to any sort of criticism that countries could offer about its human rights record. So with that, I'll let you guys turn to the Simmons article. And just a reminder that if you have any questions about anything that I say, you can always post them as a follow-up to the discussion link where I post the lecture. You can ask questions there. You can also reminder that I've got office hours Tuesdays and Thursdays, 8 to 9 on Skype, and 1:45 to 3:15 on Skype. You can also reach me via email. So on that note, I'll let you guys go and enjoy discussing that Simmons article.